morning, and thank you for coming to the Muslim Alliance of Indiana's first annual conference on domestic violence entitled Culture and Compassion, Understanding, Serving, and Empowering Immigrant Victims of Domestic Violence. We are here on our second day. Yesterday we had a number of amazing sessions on the Family Justice Center and how to set up a Family Justice Center and the importance of collaboration between organizations. And then we spoke about faith as a resource against domestic violence and how, as advocates, you can use faith to help victims of domestic violence. And then we had a session on using the law to empower immigrant victims. And then we finally finished the day off with a session on faith, culture, and domestic violence. So today we're going to start off our morning with public benefits and issues of language access. We have with us Katie Berenger and Leslye Orloff. Katie is currently a bilingual women's advocate for the Julian Center's New Life Transitional Housing Program. She graduated in 2000 from Calvin College with a BA in English secondary education. After graduating, she taught English for 2 years at the International School in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. After that, she moved to Indianapolis and taught English as a second language for 3 years in the Indianapolis Public Schools. She taught middle school students, and with a growing desire to help the Hispanic community as well as other immigrant communities in social services in the social service setting, led her to her work at the Julian Center, where she's been working for 5 years. Before working in the transitional housing, she worked as both a crisis call manager and shelter family advocate. Leslye Orloff, our other speaker, is the Associate Vice President and Director of the Legal Momentum's Immigrant Women's Program. She joined Legal Momentum's Washington, D.C. office in September of 1999 to found and direct the Immigrant Women's Program, which advocates for laws, policies, and practices that enhance legal rights of immigrant women and immigrant victims of violence against women. Leslye is a co-founder and co-chair of the National Network to End Violence Against Immigrant Women, and she received her JD from the University of California, Los Angeles, and her BA from Brandeis University. With that, I will pass it on. Turn this off? Yeah.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah? Sorry. I don't want it running into the tag. Okay, good morning. What I wanted to do as we start, before we started, there were a lot of questions yesterday towards the end of the day that related to this session. And so what Katie and I thought we would do to start is get an idea just of all the things you'd like to be able in the next hour and a half to know the answers to. Everybody's laughing. Not that I can answer them all, but it will certainly help me figure out in the presentation, and Katie, about how to focus to make sure you're getting answers to the kind of questions you have. So, anybody have questions? Things they'd like to, yesterday somebody asked some questions about housing. We'll be talking about that. What are some of the other issues that you're curious about in terms of non-citizen survivors and access to benefits and services? Anybody? Yeah.
I have a question about, well, in many counties here in Indiana, especially here, there are very little services at family resources like food stamps, TANF, and Medicaid for immigrant people. And as far as Latinos are concerned, there's many, and they've been horribly discriminated against for many, many years, and there is little, if no, language assistance. Mm-hmm. They're often denied because they're told they're undocumented, even though they have undocumented children. And is there anything that anybody can do legally about that?
Okay.
Are they required to provide interpreters to these people or not?
Okay, so I hear two sets of questions. Let me start with the latter one, and I'm repeating it so everybody can hear, and to make sure I'm understanding correctly. There's the first question. The second question is about language access, and you're talking about language access to, let's say, the state or federal agency place where they'd go to apply for benefits, right? Okay, so yes, language access, and what are the federal rules about language access, particularly with regard to people administering TANF, food stamps, various different kinds of federal benefits. We'll definitely deal with that. And we will also talk at some length about what federally funded benefits are open to non-citizens kind of by immigration status, so that somebody who's undocumented would have less access than somebody who's a lawful permanent resident. And we'll talk about how those things differ and where they differ. One of the reasons I like presenting this after the immigration status discussion yesterday is that there's whether somebody gets a U visa or the U visa for crime victims or the VAWA self-petition because they're abused by a citizen or lawful permanent resident family member, it makes a big difference in which benefits they get access to. So that there's various gradations, and we'll definitely be talking about that as well.
Well, there's one more thing. If they are receiving TANF and food stamps prior to receiving their visa, they're pending, they're waiting, they're going to trial, they're working towards that. Are any of those benefits going to have a negative effect or impact towards their application or petition?
Okay, so what you're asking is whether the receipt of benefits could potentially ultimately, both in the general world, if you're working with a victim, harm her chances to get full lawful permanent residency, and if it's an immigrant victim, whether it harms her. They're two separate questions, actually. We'll be definitely talking about in the immigration parlance or the immigration legal world, that's called public charge. And so, yeah, put that on the list and I'll make sure we get to that. Other folks over here? Oh, okay.
With the language access, can you include maybe with healthcare? And not just Spanish. We have a lot of refugee population where I'm from, Burmese, and I've recently run across Bosnian and French as well, and I know that that's very limited, and they're kind of stuck in what they can access.
Right, so the question is, in terms of access to healthcare, language access to healthcare, and in languages that are not English or Spanish. Okay? Anybody else? Okay. Kind of make sure I know which way. Okay. So what I'm going to do in the beginning this morning is talk about the range of federally funded services that are open to victims who are undocumented, people who are not documented, may never file for a Violence Against Women Act self-petition or a crime victim visa or a trafficking victim visa for a variety of reasons. Maybe this is just the law I'm first going to discuss are things that are totally open to everyone. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about that, and then Katie and I are going to lead you kind of through an exercise to think creatively based on the things we're going to be discussing about everything you can think of that you might be able to do when I set out the framework for somebody who's totally undocumented, or do immediately for somebody who's maybe in the process of getting a U visa or a VAWA self-petition, but she's not there yet. Okay, so basically what the law says, and this comes from, in 1996, they totally reformed federal benefits laws. And they changed dramatically as part of welfare reform and then again as part of immigration reform. And when Congress wrote those laws, what they did was they decided that there were certain categories of programs that even though they're making these reforms and cutting off non-citizens from a lot of benefits, there were certain things they had to be able to get. And so the primary category of those benefits are called services that are necessary to protect life and safety. And the Congress gave the Attorney General of the United States the ability to define what's on that list. And when a program's on that list, it is not supposed to be restricted based on its funding. So if it's federal funding, it's not restricted at all, and even state funding for these services should not be restricted. I'm actually doing a piece of research on that right now for the Office of Violence Against Women. They've asked us this question, and we are confirming that even state benefits shouldn't be restricted as to things that are on the necessary to protect life and safety list, and I'll go over that. But generally speaking, and so some of the things on this list are necessary to protect life and safety, and I'll go over that in a minute. But generally speaking, an undocumented immigrant has the same access to protection order court and custody court and child support as anybody else. They can get emergency shelter and transitional housing. That is the reason they get that is because those two services are on the necessary to protect life and safety list issued by the Attorney General. They can get legal services. There's a lot of confusion for a lot of people about this issue of legal services, and that's because in 1997, the Legal Services Corporation totally restricted the ability, or very much restricted the ability of legal services funded programs to represent non-citizens. And they had categories of immigrants they could represent. But at the same time, the Congress ordered them essentially to represent battered women who were abused by their spouses at the time. In 2005, VAWA 2005, one of the big changes is they reformed the law again and guaranteed that any person, without regard to immigration status, who is a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, or any crime listed in the U-Visa list you saw yesterday, has full access to legal services, and legal services funded agencies, Legal Services Corporation funded agencies, can use all of their dollars. They can use their bake sale money, they can use their federal money, they can use their state money. Any source of funding can be used to represent anyone who's a victim. So the first thing those programs should be doing, if you have clients that are seeking services from them, is asking about victimization. Because if somebody's a victim, they never have to ask immigration status questions for purposes of reporting to the federal government on funding. Yes?
Do they have to be eligible for the visa to be considered?
No, they don't have to be. You don't have to get to the point of determining visa eligibility, because this is something open when any victim is undocumented. So you could have somebody who's totally, who you have a U-Visa case and the victim is saying she absolutely is not going to cooperate with anyone. So there's no U-Visa. Okay? She is eligible for shelter and transitional housing for up to 2 years just by, sorry, she's eligible for legal services to help her with her custody case, her protection order case, etc., without regard to her status, because she's a victim. If she's not a victim, then she doesn't get those services if she's a non-citizen, unless she is in certain groups that they qualify for. Okay? Okay, as to custody and child support, I think I mentioned this yesterday. I personally, when I was practicing representing victims, I probably litigated 800 cases, protection orders, and custody cases. I would say 80% of my clients back in the in the 80s and early 90s, before VAWA, were totally undocumented. And I got custody, child support. You know, it took some work, but it's doable. And so, lawyers around the country that are working with immigrant victims in family court are doing that today, and we have all kinds of materials available to help you do it. But legally, it's open. A new thing under the child support, we just got a letter out of the Department of Homeland Security confirming that undocumented students, so kids who grew up in undocumented families, let's say, are eligible to enroll and for admission to college without regard to their immigration status. That doesn't get to who's funding that college, but they can go. Yes?
I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the legal services transition
Sure.
for a second. Is there any way that those laws would be trumped by like grants or funding sources for these agencies? Because we've had both transitional housing and legal services specifically tell us they can't be trumped.
I have been hearing this question. One of the reasons I love traveling around the country and talking to people is these kinds of questions. I've been hearing these questions forever. I have yet, my question to you and your question to them should be, show me the funding source. Ask to see the documents. Nobody's been able to produce those yet. I mean, I've asked repeatedly that if somebody is saying that a particular funder restricts, it'd be very important to look at those papers, and if you get it, we'd be happy to walk you through it with them, because generally speaking, let me give you an example from the transitional housing world. Katie and I were talking about this yesterday, and maybe you can tell them a little bit about how you do it. HUD and DOJ have both said shelter and transitional housing up to 2 years are to be available for anybody receiving HUD funding, okay? So what happens is we get calls often from people in transitional housing programs that say, my non-citizen immigrant clients are being turned away. And they say it's because of their grant. And when you scratch under the surface a little bit, what I get is, well, you know, it's a transitional housing program, so she's supposed to be able to work and eventually save money and get out of transitional housing. So I'm going to ask for her legal work authorization papers from the Department of Homeland Security. And I scratch my head and say, well, first of all, where is it written that you have to ask for that particular document? And second of all, how can the HUD secretaries say that this is open to undocumented people, but they have to have legal work authorization to get into the program? Doesn't make sense. So what I suspect is happening is, and Katie, how does it work? You have a transitional housing program and you work with immigrants. Why don't you tell people a little about that?
We don't require that as a prerequisite to get into transitional housing. It seems to me that often women that are in the process of getting documentation or don't have it are the ones that need transitional housing the most, because they don't often have other options as far as they don't have complete documentation yet, so they can't necessarily get a well-paying job, or they can't really afford to live on their own, and they have a lot, because they're immigrants, they might have a lot of other barriers. And so that is something that a third of our residents right now that are in transitional housing are immigrants. So it seems like a lot of women that come into the Julian Center shelter that have some of these immigration issues end up in the transitional housing program, and we just try to do the best we can with whatever income they have. And I know Leslie's going to jump into the public benefits part of it, but I mean, sometimes women come in and all they have is TANF because they have a child that was born in the U.S., and that's kind of their only income at first, but just kind of working with them and being patient through that process. I think I'll also jump in with this. There's some different handouts in your folder, and there's one that at the top it says U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and I would encourage you to just take a look at that right now. And then if you could turn to the second page. This is a letter that's addressed to HUD funds recipients. And at the top of that second page, it says, the list of programs open to all individuals without verification of alien eligibility includes crisis counseling intervention programs, services and assistance relating to child protection, adult protective services, violence and abuse prevention, victims of domestic violence, short-term shelter or housing, assistance for the homeless, victims of domestic violence, or for runaway, abused, or abandoned children. And then in that next paragraph, I find this really, really helpful when, you know, addressing questions like that, is that it says right here that both emergency and transitional housing programs are necessary for the protection of life or safety. Transitional housing is by nature short-term and intended to be a step from emergency shelter to permanent housing. Therefore, HUD-funded programs that provide emergency shelter and transitional housing for up to 2 years are to make these services equally available to all needing persons, and including aliens who are not qualified aliens. So, I mean, it's right there in writing that it is something that transitional housing is expected to do.
Yes?
So, in practicality, how do you enforce that? We actually are from a shelter in Anderson Alternatives, and we have received an immigrant woman from the Julian Center, and according to her, she was not eligible for the transitional housing program. And it's even difficult for non-immigrant victims because they have to produce Social Security card, they have to produce identification, they have to produce birth certificates. So practically, how do you enforce that? And actual proof. I mean, as someone who is actually in transitional, how did you help them overcome those basic barriers?
That's.
I find that very interesting, and I would like like to talk to you personally to find out how were you able to make that happen and point us in the right direction.
Sure.
Because that is certainly an issue that we're dealing with.
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
Sure.
You want me to go first? I can.
You want to go?
Sure.
And then I'll go. Okay.
As to, first of all, I don't believe there's any place in writing that the requirement of a Social Security number, for example, is required for either shelter or transitional housing. So people, the question is there's no, as far as I know, no requirement by HUD or by, some programs may be doing it. Sometimes they get confused, and I'll be going through this. Some benefits programs, not including public housing and not including shelter and transitional housing, require Social Security numbers. TANF, for example. And in terms of Social Security numbers, what the federal law says is that sometimes people will require Social Security numbers who are not here legally to work. VAWA self-petitioner is a good example. She becomes eligible for federal public benefits as once the Department of Homeland Security has issued her what's called a prima facie notice. It basically means they've reviewed the case and they've determined that it's a valid case. Okay? At that point, she's eligible for federal public benefits. But she has no immigration status. She's undocumented. She's in process, but she has no immigration status. She has no Social Security card because she can't work. And so the question is, how do you get what she's out? How do you get let's say, how do you get post-second, if you're applying for educational grants and loans, which qualified immigrant, battered immigrants qualify for, what do you put on the FAFSA form, and you have to have a Social Security number. There's a way, if you're here and legally entitled to a benefit, to go down to the Social Security Administration and get what's called a non-work Social Security number. And you have to prove to them that you're eligible for some benefit that legally requires it. Now the problem is if a program is requiring it and it's not a legal requirement, Social Security isn't going to give you a non-work Social Security number because it's very limited circumstances when they're willing to do that because they're afraid of people using them fraudulently. So yes, you can. So the question I have is, as to transitional housing, there shouldn't be any requirements of Social Security numbers. If it's on the form, you just write NA, not applicable. And if you run into a problem, we have both myself and my benefits attorney, Soraya Fata, take those questions and call people up and try to help with that and get you the documentation. We have one chapter up on the website that goes through some of this and some materials, and I have a pending brand new chapter on benefits access that's pending approval with OVW, and I'm hoping we'll have in a few months. So I hope that answers the question. There should not be those requirements. And as to proving, though, like income and things like that, let me just tell you how I used to do it with my clients years ago. Because they don't have a work authorization. But the point is they could have income in terms of a program that requires that you be on your way to sustenance. And I think to being able to sustain yourself, I think the way Katie talked about it makes a lot of sense. Because if you're working with somebody you know qualifies for VAWA or you know qualifies for a U visa, you know that at the end of that process she will have legal work authorization. And if, as many victims do, she's actually working, you know she's going to be able to work. Okay? And there's a lot of immigrant women. How many of you work with immigrant women who don't have legal papers but are working? Almost everybody. I see people either nodding their heads, laughing, or raising their hands. Absolutely true. And so what I like to tell people about this is that what happens is that there are people that are working. But there's a few things under federal law that are real, and immigration law, that are super important for you to tell any of your clients that are or may be working without permission. And that is, one, do not buy or use false papers. Then usually the question from the audience is, well, what if they're showing me the false papers they're already using? And the answer to that is, tell them to stop using them. That's all you can do. You can't control anything else. You can tell them what the law is. And the reason you tell them not to buy and use false papers is that that will, if they do that, then it will make their U visa case and their VAWA case much more complicated. It's not impossible, but complicated. One more sentence and then I'll be right with you. The second thing you want to tell them is, do not and this one I'm serious. I'm serious about both of them, but I'm really serious about this one. Do not hold yourself out as a U.S. citizen for purposes of employment or getting an immigration benefit. If you do, it will be exceptionally hard. You could be the star witness in a serial rape case, and it will be very hard for you to get a U visa. So, and you'll need a really good attorney. So I'm just saying it's very important to tell clients not to do that. Now, getting back, I know I have a question here. Getting back to where I was going with this as well is what I used to do at IU, though, when I ran the program there, where the victim had to prove she had some kind of income. And let's say she was working and getting cash, or her abuser was paying her child support in cash, or giving her money, paying her child support in cash, let's say. This is before it was all going through the court and all of that. We used to Xerox the $20 bills and circle the serial numbers and show the program that she's actually getting money and it's not the same $20 bills every week. And, you know, or some people get child support. I get child support orders and bring the child support order in, or I get, how else do you do it? What are some of the other ways?
One of the things that we've done is just we ask them to have their employer just write us a letter saying, you know, because we have to have, I guess, because rent is based on income, we have to have some kind of documentation showing that how much their income is, and so we just have the employer write a letter saying they made this much amount of money in the month of October, and we count that.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of hands. Let me go to the woman in the pink. And I have one over there too. So let's go here, first there, and then there. Okay, go ahead. No, the pink woman in front of you. Yeah.
Referring to that, I just think it's like not likely that an employer who's paying somebody in cash is going to write a letter.
Right.
I've never had a problem with documentation of some kind. Like it really hasn't ever been.
Well, I think the real
I'm sure it could be, but I haven't actually.
The question is I don't know what confidentiality laws you have in Indiana, but if there are victim advocate confidentiality laws, then your files are sealed, and then there's no harm to the employer. But because I could imagine employers being reticent, in which case I would assume that you could do like an affidavit of your client, and you could actually say, let's wait a month and I'll show you there's money going into the account. I mean, the point is that a program where you're living in transitional housing and you have some process and you're supposed to be showing that you're getting some income, as long as the client, maybe the day they walk in there, they can't show you I have this bank account. But you take a risk on them, over time you're going to see that they're actually accumulating, and that's all that really matters. So, okay, this one. Well, yeah. I want to repeat.
I can't speak on behalf of all other shelters, but I know, I mean, as the Julian Center is a domestic violence shelter, and so one way that abusers often manipulate immigrants, non-immigrants, is to take away any kind of ID or documentation. So that's something that we help women, if they come in and they don't have any of that, we help them get those things. So for us, it's not because it's the nature of the domestic violence that they're coming in, and we know that sometimes they don't have those documents with them.
So they can get a state ID.
Well, there's been a dramatic, I don't know, can you get a state ID in Indiana if you're not legally present from an immigration perspective? Everybody's going, no. Right, there are new laws that have been implemented throughout in many, many, many states in the last 5 or 10 years that severely restrict access to any kind of state identification unless you can show you're undocumented, you're legally documented. Which means, for example, your VAWA self-petitioners, once they're approved for benefits, even if there's no benefits for them in Indiana, you want to go get like a non-work Social Security card or something so she can get a driver's license because she's legally present. But she's not necessarily on the list of people who are lawfully present that the DMV has. So you have to prove there's a whole piece of advocacy there too. So I know I had two more questions over here, and then I want to kind of move on. Or should I? We're the same question. Okay, good. So let me finish this list and then go on to a few things. There's going to be plenty more time to ask questions. So Okay, so from what, and the other question I get is that piece of paper I just read, she read off of, from HUD is dated 2001. It is the same policy that's in place today. It's been in place throughout, the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, it's all the same. So nothing's changed. We're trying to get an updated version that actually addresses this issue of income and shelter and transitional housing, but that's not happened yet. People can call the police for assistance. They can cooperate with prosecutors without regard to their immigration status. And they can, we talked a little bit about this, apply for benefits for their U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident children. So many immigrant women will have kids where the kids qualify and the parents do not. And one of the things that's important about that is that that mother or father who's undocumented should be able to go into any benefits agency and seek assistance for their child who qualifies without answering any questions about their own immigration status or social security number. They have to answer income questions because there may be there's household income eligibility requirements, but that has nothing to do with legal work authorization, social security numbers, or their own immigration status. And in fact, under federal law, if a benefits worker is going to ask immigration status questions of somebody who's not applying to be part of the money given. So what happens is, mom's applying for the child. If she is eligible, if she was a U.S. citizen, she'd apply for the child and herself, and she'd get more money. So she only gets the child's piece, okay? If she's not seeking more money for herself, if that benefits agency, benefits worker asks questions about her social security number or immigration status, the benefits worker, as a matter of federal law, is supposed to tell her, I am seeking this information, and if you give it to me, I'm mandated to turn her over to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Would you like to give me the information? How many people know that's happened? It's not happening, but it's supposed to happen. And that's one of the reasons why I get so excited about doing these trainings on benefits, because it's advocates and attorneys and volunteers at your program that need to go with women who are immigrants applying for benefits to make sure that those questions aren't asked of them, and to make sure that they answer them. They say, I don't have to answer that question because I'm not applying for myself. They're not saying, I don't have to answer that question because I'm undocumented. They just say, I'm not seeking that part of the grant. I'm only seeking it for my kids, and the question should stop. Anything about that? Okay.
I don't know.
So,
I guess I could jump in. I guess I can jump in at this point and say this. At some point I wanted to. One thing that was established even before I started working at the Julian Center is we actually have one contact at the benefits office that we work with. And so if women don't have benefits when they come in, then we connect to that one caseworker. And that has really, it just makes this whole process so easier. So if I know that there are people here from different agencies and there's individuals, but if you are working with somebody to get benefits, that really helps to have that just established contact. And especially I feel like when I've had immigrant women and there's lots of just the trickiness of what they're eligible for, what they're not eligible for, that has been very, very helpful. So that's something worth looking into if your agency is having issues with getting public benefits.
Alternatively, or in addition, you might want to think about establishing a relationship for the clients, both citizen and non-citizen that are applying, and see if you can do that, because sometimes those personal relationships and developing them can really make a difference. Yes?
If a woman is telling you that she doesn't want to see her children because she doesn't want them to drag everywhere because she is shelter hopping, every 2 months she is shelter hopping, what kind of advice should we give? Like, should she fight for custody? Because she's scared that they are going to be,
So you're saying she's moving from shelter to shelter, and you're asking whether she should seek custody?
Yeah, whether she should fight for her kids' custody or not. At least they have a stable.
I think that's first of all, that's a whole different subject matter than what we're talking about today. And I think one of those issues is you have to look at, what's the level of violence? What are the kids being, susceptible to? If she's, some women on the run don't have their kids with them, and some do. But that's an advocacy, safety planning issue that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. What I'd like to do for a few minutes is move on and talk about a few more benefits, and then we'll take some more questions. The other thing that victims are entitled to is emergency Medicaid. And so I'm starting to move kind of into the health care questions that we had earlier. And emergency Medicaid is available in every law, every state. It's pretty much similar across states. There are some variations in terms of how states interpret the federal law. But the federal definition is in order to qualify for emergency Medicaid, you have to have an emergency medical condition, and that is defined as somebody who needs treatment for medical conditions that would be with acute symptoms that places the patient's health in serious jeopardy, results in serious impairment to a bodily function, or cause dysfunction of any bodily organ or part. So can you guys, given that definition, there are two things that jump out to me with immigrant survivors that would be covered, or three. Give me some ideas of what you think qualifies here. Anybody know?
Childbirth.
Childbirth, exactly. What else?
Emergency room, like victim.
A victim in emergency room. What kinds of treatment of a victim in emergency room?
Automobile accidents, something repair.
Right.
Serious.
Right, so they repair serious injury. If let's say you've got a domestic violence case and the perpetrator breaks her arm. Her arm is not organ, it's part. But the emergency room can set her arm. Okay? What else? There's another. Any of you work with sexual assault survivors? What might they need? A rape kit? Some kind of emergency exam after the rape? That would all be covered. Rape kits will be paid potentially with other sources of money, but these are the kinds of things. So what are the kinds of things that don't fall within this definition? What's not covered? Let's go back to you. You said childbirth's covered. What's not?
Care,
prenatal care is not covered. That's exactly right. And then long-term treatment of any injuries is not covered. Okay. So various states, the kinds of things that they offer that come with emergency Medicaid are labor and delivery, severe and acute symptoms, urgent pharmacy needs, so that there may be things that, she needs, let's say they broke her arm and, it took her a while to get there and there's some kind of bacterial infection that has to be treated. And then but that's not covered is ongoing medical care. So the question is, where do you get ongoing medical care for undocumented immigrants? And I know that there's a program. You want to talk about the hospital here in town?
Yeah, I mean, sorry. The one that there are different healthcare centers that will work with undocumented immigrants, but the big one is Wishard, and they have the Wishard Advantage program, which is open to anybody. They don't have to provide a social security number to receive the benefits for Wishard Advantage. So, I mean, that's a good go-to if you are working with somebody that's undocumented and needs health care.
Right. And so what happens is that in terms of outside of Indianapolis, if you're in another part of the state, where do you go? And basically there are federally funded, HHS-funded health clinics that, as a matter of federal law, are to be open to anybody who is indigent and in need. And that there's no immigration restrictions on any of that funding. And I'm sure you all heard about the whole passage of a health care bill. A lot of the money that's going into health care is going to be delivered through this public health system that is open to everyone. And the kinds of things that public health, these are some of the examples of the kinds of things public health centers can provide. You have them in the materials. And there are two websites you can go to. Like if you want to know who in your community, let's say you're in northern Indiana in a small town and you want to know where you can go for health care for your immigrant clients. You can go to the NACHA, which is the National Association of Community Health Clinics, or you can go to HRSA.gov, which is the part of HHS that funds all those folks. Put in your zip code and it'll tell you everybody that's around you. So this is a major resource that I certainly know when I started doing this work, none of us ever thought about, but is now available and pretty well funded. The other thing that can happen, I'm going to ask you guys, do you have a 72 hour report requirement? Okay.
Not for sexual assault.
Not for sexual assault. Okay, so for domestic violence, you have to report within 72 hours, and other crimes, and for sexual assault, there's no requirement. Or it's a different requirement.
We pay for the rape kits.
Okay.
And the standard on that is you have to get there, I think it's 5 days, 120 hours. You know, after 120 hours, there's nothing left.
Right, so
And this is adult victims, not children victims.
Right.
But, yeah.
So adult victims, you have to, if it's a rape case, you have to get there within the first 5 days, roughly.
And victims don't have to report to police.
And they don't have to, okay.
Cooperate with police
Great.
for the sexual assault.
So for sexual assault rape testing, they don't have to cooperate. But for victims, and so this is I think an advantage for those of us that are working with immigrant victims. If you have, I mean, one of the things that's hard to do is get a client to be willing to come forward and report. But here you have both access to VOCA if you report within 72 hours and access to a U visa potentially for an immigrant victim who's been victimized. So you can, there's two tools that are available to try to encourage her to come forward. And if she comes forward and reports, one of the things that VOCA can provide is funding for health care. Do you cover mental health care as well?
Up to $3,000 for sexual assault victims and $3,000 for
So coverage for mental health treatment up to $3,000 for sexual assault and domestic violence victims. Outpatient. Yeah, good. So this is a resource for immigrant victims that's not restricted by immigration status. More on the crime victims. So this is the list we were talking earlier about, services necessary to protect life and safety. It's the list contained in your letter. And there's a broad range of things that victims can get. So now what I'm going to do is talk about access to that's what we just talked about up to now is what everybody gets, whether or not they're undocumented or documented, okay? Now we're going to talk about what people get if they are eligible for, if they become what's called a qualified immigrant. And here what you're talking about is your VAWA self-petitioners, basically. So what you get, what they get depends on their immigration status. It depends on how long they've been in the United States. Immigrants who came to the United States before August 22nd, 1996 are eligible for much more than people that came afterwards. What benefits they get are changed by state. Indiana is one of the states that offers no additional benefits beyond what the federal benefits offer, so you don't have to worry about that problem. Although it's a problem for your clients because you have to be more creative in terms of helping them. And then there's some heightened program requirements. You had mentioned TANF and food stamps. I'll get to those in a minute. Those are the two of the most difficult to access. Let's say you have a client who, one of the things that we've developed with our OVW funding is a state-by-state analysis of post-assault health care, prenatal care, access to post-assault health care, prenatal care, forensics exams, and emergency Medicaid by state. So if you're working with a client in Indiana and she has family members in Illinois, you can go to our website and look up what the difference in benefits would be or what the difference in services would be and help her find a place that can help her in that other state. There are a range of potential barriers to access to benefits. Language is the one we'll get to in a moment. That's the big one. But you asked earlier a question about the one that's called public charge. And so what happens is generally speaking, any immigrant in this country who's going to be applying for their green card, which I think I told you yesterday isn't green, it's pink, but they're all pink, white, they keep changing the colors. But they're applying for lawful permanent residency. And when they apply for lawful permanent residency, what they have to do is prove that they're not going to become a public charge, which means in order to get their green card, they have to prove that they're not going to be a drain on the state over time, permanent drain or needing long-term some kind of assistance. And one of the things for people who are not victims is that if you got benefits for yourself or your children, it might be harder to prove that you're not going to be a drain on the state, that you're going to be able to be self-sustaining. So, but for immigrant victims, there's special access to benefits based on the fact that they're victims. So Congress didn't want to say, on one hand, you can have these benefits that you need to escape your abuser, and the other hand, if you use them, we won't give you your green card. So what Congress did is barred the Department of Homeland Security, as a matter of law, from in deciding public charge, they cannot see or ask about the benefits of a DV survivor, of a battered immigrant who's applying through VAWA. They can't consider that as part of the public charge definition. But in immigrant communities, everybody's so afraid of benefits because they know that they won't get their lawful permanent residency in the end. There's a big learning curve to teach our clients that they can in fact get these benefits without harm if they're applying through VAWA. Okay. So these are the list. Okay, I did that. Am I going the wrong way? Or I have two of them. Okay. This is kind of a chart that shows you the thought process, or what you have to go through when you're trying to figure out if a victim is eligible for public benefits. First, you have to figure. First question is, how long has she been here? Before or after August 22nd, 1996? If they've been here before, then there's much more likelihood. Let's say it's a VAWA self-petitioner who was here before 96. As soon as she gets her piece of paper that says she's got a prima facie case from Department of Homeland Security, she's eligible for TANF, for Medicaid, food stamps a little more tricky, but those two for sure, okay? If it's after, she came in after 1996, then what happens is you've got to figure out, is she a qualified immigrant? And if she's a qualified immigrant, then you can see that there's some federal benefits like available to her immediately. Post-secondary educational grants and loans are an example. Public and assisted housing is another example. There are other programs where she's going to have to wait 5 years to get benefits, okay? And I'll go through that. But if that's there's a 5-year benefit bar to TANF, Medicaid, SSI, and food stamps. But if you have a VAWA self-petitioner, again, battered spouse, applying and she's including her kids, once she gets her prima facie determination, her kids get S-CHIP. They get state child health insurance immediately because there's no wait anymore for under 18-year-old children for health care. And that's a new law that was passed about 1.5 years ago. Okay? And so who are the qualified immigrants? We've been talking about VAWA self-petitioners, but many of you are going to be working, how many of you work with refugees? Yeah, there's a big refugee population here, right? Pretty good size, different countries. So you can be, so basically any of these kinds of, any of these immigration status qualify, and those will be people that are more likely to be able to get TANF, food stamps, SSI is harder, but, and Medicaid. And child care, too, as well. You were talking about child care. You want to tell them a little about child care?
Sure, about the CCDF vouchers. I was just talking to Leslye about how here, at least I know in Indiana, that it's more about the children being citizens than the moms. If children are citizens, then they'll be able to qualify for the CCDF vouchers regardless of mom status.
And that's the Child Care Block Grant Funding or something like that,
Child Care Development Fund?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Just trying to make sure I understand the number, the letters. So yes, so it isn't everything. But if they're qualified alien battered immigrants, then they do qualify for many of these things. Okay. So here are the big questions. So who gets what? As to the big five, or before I say this, let me say one other thing. There are, for example, if you think of Health and Human Services, Health and Human Services, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services funds a whole bunch of different kinds of healthcare programs, in addition to the ones I just talked about earlier. You can go to our website and you can look up, type in health, and you will get a list of every HHS-funded program that it has no immigrant restrictions. You can do the same thing with HUD. HUD has a variety of different programs, and you can look at the programs that have no immigrant restrictions. We developed these charts, or these lists. But the most difficult are TANF, where in Indiana, if you have a battered immigrant who files her self-petition, she will be a qualified immigrant, but she has to wait 5 years from the date she got qualified to get TANF, okay? She also has to wait 5 years to get Medicaid-funded health care, and will have to rely on the community health center resources in the meantime, or VOCA. Children who are child abuse victims applying through VAWA, let's say they're abused by their father, they get health care immediately through the state child health insurance program, and IKEA, the Immigrant Child Health Health Equity Act or something like that, was passed about 1.5 years ago, and that's the new law that allows them. Food stamps are very restricted, but this is another place where a victim filing a self-petition, her kids get food stamps. So if she has 3 undocumented kids and she files her self-petition and the children are listed on her application, those children get food stamps as soon as the DHS decides she has a valid case. Okay? And then Indiana provides no state-funded. And SSI, it's the most restrictive. It's very difficult to get for immigrants. I would basically say, I mean, you could check it out, but I've never even heard of a case of an immigrant victim that's gotten it, unless they were a lawful permanent resident or whatever. It's very, very restrictive. So now that you've heard that, I think what's coming next is, what kinds of things are there other, I mean, the thing I'd like to say is we've gone through kind of public benefits, what's not restricted, what kinds of things, how are you going to work with a victim? Or actually, Katie, I'll ask you, how do you work with a victim who doesn't qualify for, let's say, TANF, or you know, what kinds of things can you do in the community that might be able to be helpful to somebody when they don't have the same kind of benefits access that U.S. citizens do?
I wonder if it would be helpful to pull out that resource list that I,
Sure.
Would that be a good time? Okay. Also in your folder, I made a resource list, and it's specifically for Indianapolis, so I know that some of you aren't from Marion County, but they're good resources for if you have an immigrant and you're not sure what to do, you can contact them. Let me find my copy. So, it's not a comprehensive list, it's just kind of people or agencies that I specifically have had contact with that I found to be helpful. I made the resource list I did it based on type of resource, and that's the first half, and then the second half are resources, agencies that are specifically here to help with immigrants. So usually those agencies cover lots of different needs, but like I mentioned, Wishart Advantage, and then the Midtown clinic that which is the mental health care through Wishart. Also, we work with immigrants, documented or undocumented. The Westside Clinic I know has Spanish-speaking therapists. I'm just going to kind of go through this, and then hopefully that'll answer some of this question. As far as transportation, I've kind of just put in some different options that I have used as resources for women. One that I find that's interesting is the Indiana Commuter Services, and they do have a Spanish-speaking staff that, I think maybe more than one, that can help women connect. If they don't have a vehicle, they can sign up and commute with somebody else to work. So that's an option. Leslye talked about education, about the different, that people are eligible for federal funding for university if they're legal permanent residents. And we have some information on ESL classes. Dress for Success, which you might have heard of, is it's been an agency that helps women get suits for interviews and for job fairs, but they also have started, I think it's been in the past year, they've started a career center, and they have been open to working with women that are in the process of even if they're not legally able to work right now, they've been open to working with women that are in the process of becoming legally able to work, so that's a good resource. And then I talked about the child care. There's some legal services listed there, and then under housing, we talked about the HUD statement, and then also Indianapolis Neighborhood Housing Partnership that helps people toward home ownership. I know they do have a bilingual person there that speaks Spanish. So those are some just kind of resources that I have found to be more immigrant friendly. And then the next section is just a list of different agencies that work specifically with immigrants. And I wanted to specifically talk about the Immigrant Welcome Center because I find that to be a really helpful resource. Basically, they have a program, what's called a Natural Helpers Program, where they just have volunteers that are from different ethnic immigrant communities in the city, and you can contact them and they can match somebody with a volunteer. So somebody's actually working with a volunteer from their community. And I find that especially helpful for women that are maybe from immigrant communities that aren't very large in Indianapolis, so there's not a lot, they don't have a lot of ability to network, because sometimes people that are natural helpers, they have contacts within their community for work, for housing, just for different options. So I won't talk about each one of these, but I feel like that's a really helpful resource, especially when you're stuck and you're trying to be creative with how can I help this person? She doesn't qualify for this, she does qualify for this. Maybe this natural helper has an idea of a job that she could get. And
let me just say, those kind of people might be good people who could potentially, if she does qualify for benefits, that might be one of the people who could actually accompany her to go apply. I mean, those agencies may have volunteers just like your agency, so you want to think creatively of what that network of support that can be creative.
Yeah, I've been impressed by the natural helpers that we've worked with. So, and then there is the to help, which I listed at the bottom of the page there, which is where when I've started working with an immigrant from a community that I've never worked with before, and I'm excited when they walk in the door with them, but then there's part of me that goes, what do I do? Because if it's somebody I've never worked with before. So I feel like just resourcing and networking, but then also using this Connect to Help has helped me connect to some of the agencies. And sometimes all of these agencies are ones that I have at least called and asked questions to. I think that it seems like when you get stuck with something and you call an agency and you ask them for ideas about the particular immigrant community that they work with, I have found them to be really helpful in kind of helping me, and especially if it's not an immigrant community that I'm super familiar with, they can kind of get me into the mindset of like as far as cultural training and just understanding that community better. So it's hard to give, for me it's really hard to give specific, this is step 1, step 2, step 3, because I feel like with all people, and especially it's really on an individual case by case, just piecing together which resources fit them the best. But I do find that especially if women come in and they, if the shelter is flexible enough to allow women to stay for a while, the length of time they actually need to be there, and then if they're able to be in a transitional housing program, that kind of gives them time to piece together some of these resources so that they're able to move out and be able to be more self-sustaining.
Great. Okay. There was a question back here, right? I saw somebody's hand go up. Yeah.
It was my question this morning. I'm the new social worker at Westside Health Center, so I'm very involved and I'm going to be working with the Hispanic population mostly.
Okay, so you're the new, I'm just going to say,
She said Westside.
okay, so you're the person they'll be looking for. Great. I like when people volunteer saying, here I am.
What's your name?
Lynette Ortiz Molina.
Okay.
Okay,
So I need both information to be graduated.
great. Wonderful. Now you're going to find it's all on bulletin boards and no. Okay, so any other questions regarding, I think we've gotten to most of the questions you asked initially about public benefits. What I'd like to do for the last half hour is move on to talk more specifically about language access. Did you have other things you wanted to cover on public benefits, or are you okay?
I think I'm good.
Okay, good. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is let's talk about, as we start to talk about language access, one of the things I'd like you to do is tell us what countries you've worked with clients from. Anybody? Yeah? Pardon? India? Burma? Mexico? Guatemala? Haiti? Pardon? Ethiopia, Dominican Republic. I'm trying to repeat them. Okay. Yes? Mexico? Guatemala? Brazil? China? I heard something else after Argentina. Mauritanians? Oh, that's a new one. Hungary? Kenya? Good. Have I missed a have we missed a continent? Anybody see any Canadians or Australians?
I work with Canadians.
Yeah, you worked with a Canadian. Okay, good. This actually, almost everywhere I go, you see similar things. And that's part of, like, particularly when we're talking about language access, and particularly when you're talking about kind of the system of learning about the culture that Katie was talking about a minute ago, it's important to know who's here and, you know, who has some community support and who doesn't. It factors into both the resources and safety planning. So that if a victim is in a very tiny little community, she might be the only people she knows who speak her language are her husband and her husband's in-law, you know, her in-laws. And so safety planning with that victim is going to be very different than a Latina or somebody from, you know, somebody that is in a community that's bigger here. And so it's important to be aware of and to know the demographics of where you're at, because it will help you both connect to resources and figure out, you know, what's available and what the stressors. I mean, one of the things I would imagine happens a lot in Indiana